Republicans fail to coalesce around Speaker choice, leaving House in limbo. Scalise was nominated by a majority of the conference, but he did not have the support of 217 lawmakers needed to claim the gavel on the floor. House Republicans were on the verge of open revolt Wednesday after the ideologically fractious conference failed to coalesce around a Speaker nominee, leaving the chamber rudderless and leaderless for an eighth day. The inability of House Republicans to agree on who will lead them has left the chamber in an effective standstill since Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, was ousted as Speaker, unable to consider any legislation to aid Israel in its war against Hamas or pass any appropriation bills to avoid a potential government shutdown in mid-November. Neither issue produced enough urgency for Republicans to quickly elect a Speaker as many had hoped, again highlighting the conference's deep divisions. Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Law, was nominated for Speaker by a majority of Republicans during a closed, secret ballot conference meeting early Wednesday. But a significant number of Republicans from across the ideological spectrum said they planned to protest his official election on the House floor. Representative Jim Jordan, Ohio, Scalise's challenger, initially refused to say he would back Scalise on the House floor. A spokesperson for the Judiciary Chairman later clarified Jordan would back Scalise and offered to give a nominating speech on his behalf. But in a conference where emotions are raw, divisions are deep and grudges are held after the McCarthy ouster, the slide was another example of the discord that has complicated House Republicans' ability to elect a new Speaker. Anyone who thought that the same problems that caused the chaos last week would magically disappear today now know how wrong they were, Representative Kelly Armstrong, Republican, North Dakota, said. With a narrow majority, Republicans can only lose 4 members to allow anything to pass through their ranks. Democrats have no plans to help elect either Republican candidate as Speaker and instead will vote for Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, New York, as they did during the 15 rounds of balloting it took for McCarthy to win the gavel this year. The stalemate led Speaker pro tempore Patrick T. McHenry, Republican, North Carolina, to recess the House to avoid the embarrassment of a failed Speaker vote. Republicans stood by, wandering around the Capitol, waiting to see if they would meet behind closed doors. Word spread early Wednesday evening that there would be no immediate conference meeting, and eventually the House adjourned, as no clear path emerged for how to elect a Speaker. At least a dozen Republicans have refused to back Scalise for Speaker. Their reasons include what they say is the lack of a plan to fund the government, no plan to change how Washington works, anger that McCarthy lost the job, and opposition to giving the next person in line a promotion. Some lawmakers also were angry at Scalise's effort to block a proposed conference rule change that would have kept House Republicans voting behind closed doors until a Speaker nominee earned 217 votes. A vote on the proposed rule change failed in Wednesday's meeting, and Scalise was able to grab the nomination with a simple majority. The House GOP conference is broken. So we oust Kevin McCarthy and all other leaders are rewarded with promotions? How does that make sense or change anything? We need to chart a different path forward, Representative Lloyd Smucker, Republican, Pennsylvania, said on X, formerly known as Twitter. Smucker said he would vote for Jordan on the floor. The battle for Speaker has become a pivotal moment for House Republicans as they look to settle scores related to divisions that have plagued the conference for years. A handful of McCarthy allies were ready to vote for him on the House floor Wednesday, even though McCarthy has publicly and privately told his colleagues not to nominate him for the role, instead of Scalise, because of a years-long feud between both leaders. I just choose not to participate in what I consider to be an injustice, said Representative Carlos A. Jimenez, Republican, Florida, who has pledged to vote for McCarthy when the election comes to the House floor. Another group of conservatives, many of whom supported Jordan during the closed meeting, remained undecided about whether to back Scalise or continued to say they would back neither candidate if nominated. Scalise narrowly topped Jordan in a conference-wide vote, winning the majority 113-99, with nearly a dozen voting present or for someone else, a significant number since Scalise can only lose 4 votes on the House floor. Many members of the House Freedom Caucus, an ideological faction Jordan founded in response to Scalise's leadership of the Republican Study Committee years ago, have continually expressed worry that Scalise as Speaker would just be an extension of McCarthy's leadership, given that both have served in GOP leadership for about a decade. We have to quit having this place run the way it was run, said House Freedom Caucus Chair Scott Perry, Republican, Pennsylvania, who is not committed to supporting Scalise. Multiple Republican lawmakers said it was a monumental mistake for Scalise to block a measure that would have united the Republican conference behind a speaker nominee behind closed doors. Nearly 100 members backed a rule change that would require the speaker to find 217 Republican votes before they adjourned from their closed, no-phones-allowed conference meeting. Scalise and his allies worked on tabling the motion because they knew he would win the nomination with a simple majority, and made a bet that it would be easier to coalesce around him on the House floor with the public pressure of the cameras rather than if the vote were closed. They were able to successfully table the proposed change. Representative Chip Roy, Republican, Texas, said he was a hard no on Scalise because the vote to elect a speaker was rushed to the floor, saying Scalise made a huge mistake. Several McCarthy allies left the closed meeting looking serious and angry, with many refusing to talk with reporters. A handful had been discussing nominating McCarthy on the floor, but when Scalise won the nomination in conference, it solidified the decision for a certain bloc to do so. For some members, the decision to stick with Jordan was based on various plans to ensure the government is funded by November 17, when a short-term funding extension expires. Multiple lawmakers who attended candidate forums this past week said Jordan proposed putting forward a stopgap spending bill, known as a continuing resolution, that funds the government at current levels for 6 months. But many hard-right members are vehemently against any short-term spending bill because it would rely on Democratic support to pass, a reason McCarthy was ousted. But they are also supportive of a mechanism that would be triggered if the government is funded at current levels through the beginning of the year. A 6-month CR would trigger an automatic 1% cut in government spending in April if Congress is unable to pass its funding bills. Representative Thomas Massie, Republican, Kentucky, who proposed the 1% cut that became law during the debt ceiling debate earlier this year, met with Scalise after the closed meeting and said on X that he let Scalise know in person that he doesn't have my vote on the floor, because he has not articulated a viable plan for avoiding an omnibus. It's really, really hard for this Republican House to govern. We have incredibly tight margins and, frankly, some members who have a hard time getting to yes on almost anything on almost every week, Representative Dusty Johnson, Republican, South Dakota, said. I'm a pragmatist. I just understand that I never get everything I want in any negotiation. There are a lot of people around here who don't understand that, and it makes it hard to govern. Asked whether this standstill complicates House Republicans' ability to retain the majority in next year's elections, Johnson skirted the question saying, it would be easier with bigger margins and, frankly, I think would be easier in a political environment where people understood that governing requires some give and take. Compounding the challenges for both Scalise and Jordan are their pasts. Representative Nancy Mace, Republican, South Carolina, who voted in support of ousting McCarthy last week, said she could not vote for Scalise because she learned Tuesday evening that he spoke at a white supremacist rally while serving as a state representative in Louisiana. While a Scalise advisor confirmed he spoke at an event founded by former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke in 2002, he denied knowing that the event was affiliated with racists and neo-Nazis. Given what's happening in Israel right now, I just cannot support someone who's associated with anything that is divisive, whether it's race or religion. I'm just a hard pass on that, she said. Many other moderate Republicans have expressed similar concerns over Scalise's past, but they have not done the same with Jordan, who has been accused of ignoring a sexual abuse allegation that Ohio State wrestlers made against a doctor while Jordan coached there. Paul Kane, Theodoric Meyer, and Mariana Alfaro contributed to this report. Representative Lloyd Smucker's state was misidentified in an earlier version of this report. Smucker represents Pennsylvania in Congress, not Texas. This version has been corrected. Work advice: when an interviewer grills you on your personality. Tackling workplace communication challenges, from interpreting interview questions to supporting someone with a stutter. Reader 1, I was interviewing for a promotion. I thought the interview was going well until one interviewer asked, how would your best friend describe you? I was flummoxed. I don't have a best friend. I thought of one person who was my closest friend, but they probably would not call me their best friend. I then wondered how that person would describe me. This was all in about 5 seconds. The next 5 seconds I spent wondering how I should respond because, really, how am I supposed to know what a best friend would say? I only know what I hope they would say. I felt flustered for the rest of the interview and didn't get the promotion. Is that a reasonable or fair interview question? Should the wording be revised, i.e., how would your friends describe you? Carla, your interviewer's question sounds to me like a cover version of the classic hit, what would you say are your best qualities? It's encouraging you to hype yourself the way someone who loves and admires you would do, without fear of seeming boastful. The best friend can be a purely hypothetical figure, no one's going to demand a reference. But even a seemingly casual question like that can trip up a literal-minded candidate who is trying to give honest answers. Situations like this one show how personality interviews, as opposed to skills-based interviews, require candidates to think on multiple levels at once. They have to figure out what the interviewers really want to know and what answer will give that information in the best possible light. For example, thinking literally, my first impulse would be to reply that my best friends would say I'm hilarious for reasons that are inappropriate in a professional setting. But knowing what most employers value and want to hear, I would ideally settle on something equally true, but safer, that I'm loyal, reliable, a good problem solver. Is a question like this reasonable or fair? Sure, if they're looking to fill the position with someone who is quick to anticipate and deliver an answer they like in a manner they're accustomed to. Someone, in short, who thinks like them. But it could exclude candidates who are excellent performers but who come from a different culture, process things differently, or are just literal-minded. If you happen to fall in one of those latter categories, it's okay to seek clarification. If they're going to judge you for not reading their minds, that's not the kind of environment you want to work in. So be honest, I'm having trouble answering that question. Can you ask it a different way, or give me an example of what you're looking for? Or reword the question yourself, are you asking what people tend to like about me? Incidentally, if this sort of communication stumble happens to you often, at work or in your personal life, it might be worth examining in greater detail with a counselor or career coach. Interview questions like the one you encountered are common, so you might as well come up with a strategy for responding to them. Reader 2, I lead a team of knowledge workers, and our function has us communicating live on a consistent basis. I have a direct report with a mild but noticeable stutter. What's the best way to support them in the workplace? Carla, a stutter may or may not be considered a disability requiring accommodation. Fortunately, you don't sound like the kind of manager who needs the threat of an ADA lawsuit to be a decent human being. The Job Accommodation Network, AskJan.org, has a page dedicated entirely to supporting workers and job candidates who stutter. According to JAN, the simplest, lowest effort thing you can do is listen patiently when they speak. Focus on and respond to the content of what they're saying, not how it comes out. Resist the urge to interrupt, finish sentences for them or put words in their mouth. The next level is to ask what, if anything, they need to help them perform better. JAN mentions flexible scheduling around energy levels or speech therapy sessions, as well as technological solutions, such as text-to-voice or fluency devices. Maybe they just need extra time to prepare before delivering presentations. The key is to ask and then follow their lead. You might consider it a kindness to take them off oral presentation duties, but you shouldn't assume that's what they want, especially if it means missing out on opportunities to move up. You can also make yourself aware of the ableism and bias that stutterers, including our current president, face, including mockery and judgments about their intelligence, capability, or honesty, and make sure those attitudes have no chance of thriving on your watch. Model patient, supportive, team-oriented behavior, and hold everyone to the same high standards while allowing room for accommodations that let them reach those standards. He claimed he was helping police on January 6. He was convicted of assault. As he saw the mob drag a fellow D.C. police officer down the steps of the U.S. Capitol, Braden Dyer started to pull out his service weapon. From behind, another officer put his hand over Dyer's and told him to put the gun away. Police officers have said they refrained from using firearms during the January 6 riot because they understood many in the crowd to be armed and did not want to get into a shootout. But Dyer testified in federal court last week in the trial of a man accused of taking part in the attack on his colleague, saying he that thought deadly force would have been justified after Officer Andrew Waite was punched, kicked and stomped by the mob. I took it upon myself to preserve his life, Dyer testified. On Wednesday, Ronald Maccabee, 29, was found guilty of taking part in that assault on the West Terrace of the Capitol, the site of intense violence where in minutes multiple police officers were swarmed and beaten while trying to block a tunnel into the building. Maccabee, a sheriff's deputy at a rural Tennessee jail at the time, was on medical leave on January 6 because he had fractured his shoulder in a car accident 6 days before. Maccabee pleaded guilty last month to assaulting another police officer, Carter Moore, in the tunnel. But he insisted at trial, for the assault of Waite, that he was trying to protect the officer and alert police to the body of an unconscious protester. Maccabee was found guilty on 5 charges, including assaulting, impeding or resisting an officer and civil disorder, as well as 3 related to having a deadly or dangerous weapon, his reinforced gloves. Body camera video shows that after Waite got knocked down, Maccabee grabbed the fallen officer's legs and pulled Waite toward him. Moore tried to intervene, hitting Maccabee with his baton, and Maccabee hit back repeatedly. Maccabee grabbed Waite again when another rioter pulled on the officer's leg. After they went backward down some stairs together, Maccabee and Waite tussled, pushing each other back and forth. For about 20 seconds, Maccabee, body weight about 300 pounds, was on top of Waite while rioters barraged the officer on all sides. But Maccabee can also be heard on video yelling "no" and "quit" as other rioters tried to reach Waite. He then said, "I'm trying to help you, man," and Waite replied, "I know, help me up." Testifying in his own defense, Maccabee said he was trying to help Waite the whole time, first by repositioning his legs and then by bracing himself over the fallen officer to protect him from the mob. He said he attacked Moore because he was frustrated and needed space. "In my mind, I'm trying to help." He was also upset, he said, that no one was helping a woman passed out at the top of the steps. Maccabee said he got pulled into the crowd with Waite involuntarily and only pulled Waite's hands off his vest because the officer's grip was choking him. Multiple officers testified that Maccabee prevented them from rescuing Waite, and Waite himself testified that he was only able to climb back behind the police line when someone shoved Maccabee off him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Alexander Foster suggested in closing arguments that Maccabee had a change of heart once surrounded by attackers yelling "traitor" and "get him." Waite testified in court for the first time about his experience in the maelstrom of violence. "I'm flat on my back," Waite said. "I am in a great deal of pain, I am incapacitated." After a long pause, he added, "I am wondering if I was going to die." Waite's gas mask was torn off, and he was hit in the face with bear spray. "It felt like I was underwater, it felt like I was suffocating," he said. "I don't know really how well a camera can even convey, just getting hit so much." His baton, helmet and cell phone were stolen as he was beaten. Before his vision clouded, Waite said he was able to see the patches on Maccabee's protective vest, on one side, sheriff, and on the other, the emblem of the 3%ers, a right-wing anti-government movement. A slim man with a thick mustache, Waite said that Maccabee's weight on him felt like a planet. Defense attorney Benjamin Schiffelbein argued to jurors that Waite and the other officers, contending with flying objects and constant assaults, were too disoriented to accurately remember what happened. After getting free, Waite staggered into the Capitol, still unable to see from the chemical spray in his eyes. On his body camera recording, another officer who saw Waite immediately shouted for medical help. When another officer poured water over Waite's head to clean out his eyes, blood streamed down his face. Waite then asked, as Officer Michael Fanone did after being assaulted by the same crowd about an hour earlier, whether they had kept the door to the Capitol closed. "I wanted to know that everything I had been through hadn't been in vain," he testified. Waite was taken out in an ambulance and treated for a concussion and a head wound that had to be stapled shut. Days later, he said that when he brushed his hand through his hair, he could feel goose eggs all over his skull. He was unable to return to work for months. Meanwhile, Maccabee had turned back to the unconscious woman in the tunnel. He tried to perform CPR on her but was yanked off by another protester. Officers then pulled her behind the police line. Roseanne Boyland, 34, died of what was determined to be a methamphetamine overdose. Maccabee cried on the stand recalling that moment. "I felt like I failed," he said. "I couldn't save her." Conservatives, including some Republican members of Congress, have suggested that police bear responsibility for Boyland's death. "We're trained not to render aid until a scene was safe," Moore testified. "That scene was nowhere near safe enough for us to render aid to civilians. After his scuffle with Maccabee, Moore said he was continually being assaulted until I was rendered not conscious. Seconds before Waite's fall, another officer had been pulled into the mob by his helmet and beaten with a flagpole and a crutch. Maccabee had also been hit in the head, and his shoulder was hurting. Hunched over in pain, he asked the police officers if they would let him into the tunnel to recover. "I can't go back that way," body camera video shows him telling one officer. "Have you seen these?" Maccabee doesn't finish the sentence, but on the stand he said he was afraid of the other rioters, who he thought now considered him a traitor for helping the police. Still, Maccabee struggled to explain why he was at the front of the police line at all, except that he was curious about what was going on. Nor could he explain why he picked up and briefly wielded a police baton, except that it was nicer than the one he had back home. He admitted that he was hit in the leg with a rubber bullet before arriving at the tunnel entrance, and saw police fighting to keep rioters back, but kept moving forward. He suggested the police were partially to blame. There could have been better de-escalation techniques, Maccabee testified. Asked how he would have handled the rioters, he said, "I would have told them to leave." Maccabee said he was part of no formal 3%er group and thought the logo was a patriotic nod to the popular myth that only 3% of colonists fought in the American Revolution. But before the riot, Maccabee had expressed interest in a local chapter of the Proud Boys, a group known for street clashes, and suggested he was ready to engage in violence on January 6. "I will rise or fall alongside you," he told a friend, while planning the DC trip. "This is for future generations." Along with the protective vest, he wore gloves with reinforced knuckles and discussed bringing a tire puncture. And while on the stand he described himself as feeling embarrassment and shame over the riot. On January 7 Maccabee smiled for a picture with a newspaper headlined, "Insurrection." A day later, in a message shown in court, he texted another friend, "I've shed blood for my country. By the hands of the swamp. I will shed more in the days to come." Schiefelbein said that was masculine puffery, and that Maccabee's real feelings could be seen in video of him walking away from the tunnel, hunched over and defeated. Is the U.S. getting involved as Israel fights Hamas in Gaza? What to know? The United States has pledged unequivocal support for ally Israel, underlining its right to defend itself after an unprecedented incursion by Hamas militants from the Gaza Strip killed at least 1,300 people there and wounded about 3,300. President Biden denounced the attacks by Hamas, a militant group that controls the Gaza Strip and has been designated a terrorist organization by the United States since 1997, as sheer evil, in a speech on Tuesday. "We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack," he said. Biden's forceful remarks and promise of military aid underscore the close, historic relationship between Israel and the United States. The United States was the first country to recognize Israel when it declared independence in 1948. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. Washington provides $3.3 billion annually in military aid and an additional $500 million in missile defense funding. The United States has provided Israel a total of $158 billion, according to the Congressional Research Service. Here's what to know about U.S. and Israel relations, and what Washington has said so far about Israel's war with Gaza. What is the U.S. doing as the Israel-Gaza war begins? Amid fears this could turn into a wider regional conflict, this week U.S. Central Command dispatched a carrier strike group to the eastern Mediterranean Sea as a step to deter other actors from joining the conflict. The USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier was sent to deter any actor seeking to escalate the situation or widen this war, the military said in a statement. A senior defense official previously told the Washington Post that the United States is deeply concerned about the possibility that Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Shiite militant group and political party that is Lebanon's most dominant armed force, will join the conflict. Analysts also say there's a risk tensions will escalate further if Israel and Washington blame Iran, which has helped arm and train Hamas, for the attack. The Biden administration is also maintaining close contact with the Israeli government as 17 Americans remain unaccounted for, at least some of whom are believed to have been taken captive by Hamas. At least 25 Americans were killed in the attack, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said as he arrived in Israel on Thursday in a show of support and solidarity. U.S. government officials have been deployed to consult and advise the Israeli government on hostage recovery, Biden said in his White House remarks Tuesday. "I have no higher priority than the safety of Americans being held hostage around the world," he said. Blinken was also in Israel to work on the emerging hostage crisis. As he boarded a plane at Joint Base Andrews, Blinken told reporters that the United States wants to make sure to the best of our ability, and I know Israel wants to make sure to the best of its ability, that civilians are not harmed in Gaza. Israeli forces have bombed the densely populated Strip, which has been under a joint Egyptian-Israeli blockade since 2007, have cut off Gazans' access to water and fuel in a retaliatory siege for the Hamas attack on Israel and are massing troops near the enclave. Washington has not condemned the siege, which UN Human Rights Commissioner Volker Turk on Tuesday said was prohibited under international humanitarian law. Israel has to take steps to defend itself, Blinken said Thursday. It has to make sure that any ongoing threat is dealt with, and I believe it has to make sure that, going forward, what happened doesn't happen again. The first plane carrying American ammunition landed Tuesday at Israel's Nevatim Air Force Base. Cooperation between the armies of the two countries is a key part of ensuring regional security, Israel Defense Forces spokesperson Daniel Hagari said. The Department of Defense has ordered more advanced fighter jets, including F-16s, to squadrons in the region, it said this week. Officials are also working to expedite shipments of military equipment already ordered by Israel. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters this week that the United States had no intention to put U.S. boots on the ground. Central Command in its statement said the forces in the area include the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, with its 8 squadrons of attack and support aircraft, along with the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser and guided missile destroyers. In his remarks on Tuesday, Biden said he would ask Congress to approve an urgent military aid package for Israel. But that task has been complicated by the recent ouster of Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, as House Speaker, which has left the chamber in limbo. In the aftermath of the attack, Israeli officials have requested that Washington replenish Israel's stockpile of Iron Dome ground-to-air missile interceptors, small-diameter bombs, and ammunition for machine guns, The Washington Post has reported. Israel has requested more cooperation on intelligence sharing, particularly in southern Lebanon, U.S. officials told the Post. Washington sends aid to the Palestinian territories each year for humanitarian purposes and to support the Western-backed Palestinian Authority based in the West Bank. Trump cut more than $200 million in funding to Palestinians in 2018, but the aid was restored and expanded under the Biden administration. Between April 2021 and March 2022, the United States provided slightly more than $500 million in humanitarian aid to Palestinians through organizations such as the United Nations and the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department said. Biden last year announced an additional $316 million in aid that included funding for hospitals and improved internet connectivity in the Palestinian territories. What is the Biden administration's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The Biden administration has echoed a long-standing U.S. position that the best outcome is a comprehensive, negotiated two-state solution. But there have been no meaningful peace negotiations in years, and experts and analysts say the growing number of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, as well as instances of violence between settlers and Palestinians, has made the prospect of a two-state solution increasingly remote. In July 2022, a few months into his term, Biden traveled to the West Bank and met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Biden said he still supports the creation of independent Israeli and Palestinian states, formed within borders approximately equivalent to what existed before the 1967 war. Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The Biden administration has also lobbied regional power broker Saudi Arabia to establish closer trade, security, and political ties with Israel, and the State Department has said that it is dedicated to deepening and expanding normalization and integration between Israel and Arab and Muslim majority states. This built on the Trump administration's efforts to achieve normalization between Israel and its neighbors. Under Trump, Israel signed normalization agreements with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco. What is Biden and Netanyahu's relationship? Biden and Netanyahu have both held positions of political leadership in their respective countries for decades and have a long personal history of cooperation as well as disagreement. Biden has been pointed in his criticism of settlement expansion and violence in the West Bank under Israel's current far-right government. Most recently, the two traded public barbs over Netanyahu's refusal to call off his proposal to limit the Supreme Court's power in Israel, with Biden saying in March that he was very concerned and telling reporters, they cannot continue down this road. Biden waited months to invite Netanyahu to the White House after he began his sixth term, a move that was widely perceived in Israel as a slight. According to the State Department's records, Netanyahu in his years as Prime Minister has traveled to the United States 27 times for official visits, working trips, and to attend international summits or sign treaties. But the two leaders appeared to patch over some of their differences, and in September, when Biden and Netanyahu met in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Biden invited him to the White House for an official visit before the year's end. Before the meeting, Biden said, "Even where we have some differences, my commitment to Israel, is ironclad." Tyler Pager, Liz Sly, Ishan Tharoor, Abigail Hosloner, Amy B. Wong, Steve Hendricks, Toulouse Olarenapa, and Merrill Cornfield contributed to this report. Victoria Bissett and Ruby Mellon. Israel formed a unity government. Who's in the new emergency war cabinet? Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has struck a power-sharing deal with his political rival, centrist Benny Gantz, to form an emergency unity government that will oversee Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. Netanyahu promised to crush and eliminate the militant group in a speech Wednesday evening, responding to Hamas's deadly assault on Israel last weekend that claimed the lives of at least 1,300 people in Israel. The war cabinet will be pivotal in what comes next. At least 1,354 people in Gaza have been killed, health authorities there said, as Israel pummels the enclave with airstrikes. Israeli troops are massing troops ahead of a potential ground assault in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas is holding more than 100 hostages it took from inside Israel, a group officials say includes Americans. Our standing here, shoulder to shoulder, is a clear message to our enemies, and more importantly, a message to all citizens of Israel. We are all together, we are all mobilizing, Gantz said. Here's what to know. What is Israel's war cabinet and who is in it? Parliament is set to meet Thursday to approve the unity agreement with the opposition, which brings Gantz's National Unity Party, a centrist electoral coalition, into Netanyahu's far-right governing coalition. Gantz, a former military chief of staff and leader of the Blue and White Party, will also join a select war cabinet that will otherwise include only Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Other members of the opposition will join a broader security cabinet. Gadi Eisenkot, also a former army chief of staff who was a member of the National Unity Party, will serve as an observer on the war cabinet along with Ron Dermer, a close Netanyahu ally and former Israeli ambassador to the United States. While the coalition agreement is set to end when the conflict is over, Gantz will now have significant influence, akin to that of another prime minister. Not only will the war cabinet be the political authority for the war against Hamas, all other political initiatives, except vital economic measures, will be on hold without the approval of both Netanyahu and Gantz. That would include Netanyahu's controversial judicial overhaul, plans to limit the power of the Supreme Court of Israel over government actions, which sparked mass protests this year. Israel's opposition leader, Yair Lapid, who called for an emergency government in the aftermath of Saturday's assaults, was reportedly invited to join the cabinet, but has in recent months rejected the idea of a deal with Netanyahu over the presence of two far-right-wing ministers in his coalition, nationalist settler leaders Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Why is Netanyahu forming an emergency unity government? Even before last Saturday's attack, which caught Israel by surprise, Netanyahu was grappling with a major political crisis. His government, the most right-wing in Israel's history, has faced legal challenges and mass protests for months over controversial reforms to limit the power of the judiciary. In the aftermath of the Hamas assault on Israel, the deadliest in the country's history, Netanyahu was criticized for both his response and the lack of military experience in his cabinet. The new war cabinet includes Gantz, as well as Eisenkot as an observer, both opposition figures who are also former military heads. Who is Benny Gantz, the opposition figure in Israel's war cabinet? Gantz's 38-year military career included overseeing a 1989 operation to airlift 14,500 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. A decade later, he commanded Israeli forces occupying southern Lebanon and then oversaw the country's withdrawal from the region. He was the Israeli military's chief of staff during 2 wars in Gaza in 2012 and 2014, for which he and the government faced international criticism. A UN report in 2015 concluded that both Israel and Palestinian militant groups had probably committed war crimes in the 2014 conflict. Since leaving the military and entering politics, Gantz has positioned himself as the antithesis to Netanyahu's savvy, sometimes cutting political style, experts say. He's like the un-Netanyahu, David Makovsky, a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, told the Washington Post in 2019, adding that his low-key, steady demeanor makes people see him as a person of integrity and country first, Makovsky added. Gantz and Netanyahu came together to create an emergency government during the pandemic in 2020, but the agreement collapsed after 6 months. Who is Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister? Yoav Gallant is the Israeli defense minister and a senior ally of Netanyahu, although he urged the prime minister to halt his controversial plans to overhaul the judiciary earlier this year. At the time, Netanyahu announced that he had fired Gallant, but he never officially dismissed him. On Monday, Gallant announced a full siege of Gaza. No electricity, no food, no fuel, he said. We are fighting animals, and we will act accordingly. The United Nations has condemned the tactic, with Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying in a statement Monday, the humanitarian situation in Gaza was extremely dire before these hostilities, now it will only deteriorate exponentially. Brian Peach, Mikhail Klimentov and Noga Tarnopolsky contributed to this report. How historic the House GOP's chaos is, by the numbers. Republicans could elect a new Speaker of the House this week. Or they might not. And nobody is holding their breath. No one at this point is even remotely close to a majority, Representative Kat Kamak, Republican, Florida, told the Washington Post on Tuesday about the race between House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, and Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio. So I think that we're not just going to be here for a couple extra days. My money says weeks. Sure enough, the GOP conference on Wednesday made Scalise its nominee by a narrow margin, setting up a floor battle that could go any number of ways. Some Jordan supporters say they'll keep voting for him, some Republicans voted for neither man. And for now Scalise got the support of only about half of his conference. If Kamak is right that this could take days or weeks, Republicans would only add to already historic milestones resulting from their internal chaos. But just how historic? Here's a look at the numbers and historical facts. McCarthy's unprecedented ouster. Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, last week became the first speaker to be removed from office by a vote of the House. Only once before had the House even voted on a so-called motion to vacate, in 1910. And only twice before had such a motion even been filed, the other being against GOP Speaker John A. Boehner last decade. There is currently debate within the GOP about whether it will continue to allow one member to force such a vote. But unless it changes the rule, the GOP's razor-thin majority and an unruly caucus of hard-right members make it entirely possible the motion against McCarthy won't even be the only one this Congress. McCarthy's historically short tenure. That unprecedented ouster left the GOP Speaker with an historically short tenure. Technically, McCarthy's 269 days in office is the third shortest. But the other two don't really compare. Theodore Pomeroy served 1 day in 1869 between Schuyler Colfax leaving for the vice presidency and Pomeroy's own retirement from Congress. And Michael C. Kerr served 258 days in 1875 before his death from tuberculosis, a condition he had contracted long prior. An historically long vacancy. The House has gone 8 days without a speaker this month. GOP Representative Patrick T. McHenry of North Carolina serves as Speaker pro tempore but is limited in his powers. It has also gone 12 days without a speaker this session, when you include the 4 days it took to elect McCarthy. That appears to be the longest we've gone without a speaker in more than a half-century. There was an 18-day gap in 1971. But even that isn't really the same thing. Throughout history, there have often been gaps because a speaker exited as a Congress concluded, and the new Congress didn't convene and elect a new speaker right away. The 18-day gap in 1971 occurred because Congress convened rather late, on January 21. A better comparison would seem to be 1961, when John McCormack served as Speaker pro tempore for 28 days while Congress was in session, as then Speaker Sam Rayburn was ailing and would soon die. McCormack was then elected Speaker when Congress reconvened in 1962. If this takes 16 more days, as Kamak suggests it could, we'd surpass 1961. Of course, back then there was at least a titular speaker. The number of ballots. Republicans in January already set a post-Civil War high for the number of ballots it took to elect McCarthy, 15. It was only the second time since then that an election even required multiple ballots. It was also the fifth most in history. Should the next election take 7 ballots, this Congress will have moved into a tie for fourth place when it comes to how many times it voted on a new speaker. Climbing the list beyond that would indeed take several days or weeks. Third place is 44 ballots. Second is 63. And first place is 133 ballots between 1855 and 1856, surely something to shoot for. Jeffries could set a surprising record. The GOP's failure to elect a speaker could soon lead to a rather weird distinction. Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, New York, might set a post-1913 record for most total votes for speaker, despite never winning the job and having received only a single vote before this year. Jeffries received 3,179 votes for speaker across the 15 votes in January as Democrats remained united in their support for him. That was actually more than McCarthy's 3,072, because Jeffries got more votes than McCarthy until the 12th ballot. Philip Bump ran down some of these numbers while the January balloting was underway. McCarthy has still received the most votes since 1913, by virtue of the 15 ballots and his totals in earlier speaker elections when Republicans were in the minority. He's at 3,474 votes, while Jeffries has 3,180, he got 1 vote in 2021. Both surpassed the previous post-1913 record holder, Rayburn, who was on the ballot for 12 speaker elections and won 10 of them. But if there's more than one ballot to pick the new speaker, Jeffries will in all likelihood have secured the most votes for speaker over the past 110 years, reinforcing the GOP's discord and how unusual all of this has been.